I want to say blessings to all of you and thank you for inviting me to share a few words with you today. My name is Jerry Tello, and I come to you in a very humble way, offering teachings, experience, stories, and really in a very traditional way, just offering blessings to all of you. I want to thank you for being here, for showing up, for listening to this presentation, because right away it shows that you're interested. You're interested in learning. You're interested in building on who you are, but as fathers, as father figures, as uncles, as big brothers, whoever you are in reference to the children in your lives and in your communities. Let me just say that it's a blessing to have you, because the children need us and they're waiting for us. As I begin, I just want to share a little bit about who I am, because what you'll hear about me, but you'll also hear about the journey that I've taken and what I've learned along the path. And I'm still learning. I'm still learning as well. As I mentioned, my name is Jerry Tello. I come from a family where my father is Jorge Perez Tello. And he comes from a background of Tapilan, Coahuitecan, and Texan roots, out of that San Antonio, Texas area. And he comes from a family of 15. So we had a large number of brothers and sisters. And on the other side, my mother, Maria Susolaga Ramos, who comes from Chihuahua, Mexico. And she has Toramara and Mexica roots. And she came from 14. So we come from large families. And they, came together someplace. There's different stories about how they met, how they got together, why they got together. But they came together and married. And then some of my brothers and sisters were born in Texas. And then some of us were born in California. And I was actually raised in California in the Los Angeles area, but more specifically in Compton, in a neighborhood, really African-American and Mexican-rooted population in a certain part of town that I guess you would consider the poor side of town, although my parents never said poor. They never referred to that word of us being poor. In fact, from their point of view, we're very blessed. And so I grew up with a lot of brothers and sisters. I grew up in a home in which my mother and father were there for a part of my lives. And then I grew up with the extended family, relatives that would just drop over. It was not coincidental or surprising that on a Friday night we would hear, and we'd go to the door. There's one of my uncle and there are many kids, and we had to look happy like they were there. And unexpected, but that's what family does. They show up sometimes, and my mother did what we do in traditional families. She liked something to eat, and so she'd go in that refrigerator or whatever she had on the stove and served them and fed them. And me being one of those little kind of worrywart kids, worried about everything, I was worried about my mom feeding them all the food. They were going to run out or something. And my dad, being a very proud man who worked very hard as well, was very generous. And so I grew up in that type of family with a father that was a very loud talking father. Yeah, he talked loud all the day. Hey, come here, what's the matter? Get over here. My friends would come over. What's the matter? Your dad, man? I said, no, that's the way he talked all the time. I just talked loud all the time. And so I grew up with a father that was very, if you will, loud talking, kind of boisterous, talking like this with his hands all the time. And we, many people think, well, your dad's angry. No, that's when my dad was good. You didn't worry when my father talked loud. You were when it got quiet. When he got quiet, it's like, oh, something's going on. Dad's upset. So, you see me with this hat on, right? I wear a hat because my dad wore a hat, and not all the time, but when he was in a good place, my dad wore a hat, and he didn't have a good hat like this, he had working hats because my dad was a working man, and later on, I began to understand my father's story and understand, his dreams and his wishes, which he didn't, share outright like that. He just lived his life. He just worked those jobs. And later on, I realized that my father, left his family in Texas and came to California, came to Los Angeles, worked very, very hard, not because he wanted to have a lot of money or wanted to do all these wonderful things, but he did it for us children. He wanted us to have a better life. And one of the ways that he did that was working hard. But he, wore a hat. He wore a hat to work, wore a hat to go outside. It was sunny, but also I think, to kind of later on realize that he put some things under that hat that I didn't know about. Things that went on that I didn't realize till much later, till I became a father. What dads have to go through. And so, like maybe many of you, my father didn't live with his family. He had to leave his family, and he traveled to Los Angeles so that we could have a better life. And in my many years of working with fathers, there's so many fathers that have to leave their families and leave their home and leave their original land with wishes and hopes and dreams that they could have a better life for their children. But I've also met many, many fathers, and some that were relatives of mine, that left their homeland and left their people, and even left their mothers and fathers themselves because of danger, because they had to, because it wasn't safe any longer, because there was no work there. And so they had to flee and go to someplace new, someplace foreign, someplace that really was not welcoming to them. And just to live another day was a struggle. So for that reason, I really want to just honor you and thank you for being willing to do what you do as fathers, as uncles, as brothers, as older brothers, as neighbors, in looking at raising children, because this thing we call fatherhood is often not an easy thing. No one gives us a book, and no one says, "Here, read this," or "Here are the lessons about it." You learn it on your own, and I didn't realize that my father was learning as he was going. I didn't realize that my father was, doing the best he could, and didn't realize that sometimes my father didn't really know what to do. Because in my eyes, my dad knew everything. In my eyes, my dad was stronger than anybody. In my eyes, my dad was the hero. In my eyes, my dad was my role model. And so what he did, I kind of did too. And so I have a loud talking voice too. And that loud talking voice, helps me when I speak. But I had to realize that sometimes that loud talking voice, like my father's, also can be something that can scare kids and maybe make us not want to be open or not feel safe and all of those things. But I didn't learn that till much later in my life, And at the same time, growing up in my family, I realized that my father wanted us to be the best that we could, and wanted us to be good kids, and that behaved, and that people saw in a good way, and were responsible kids. But we were now living in a society that was teaching us different values. We learned about respecting elders, and we learned about being respectful and honorable, and even when relatives came over, especially with elders, you honored the elders, and we learned in our home to only speak when you're spoken to, and we learned that we were supposed to be generous, and when relatives came over, that you gave up your seat and you fed them and all of that. But then we went to school, and we were learning different values. We were learning that we had rights, and that we could speak on our own, and that we were independent, and that we need to voice what we wanted, and what we wanted mattered, and all of that. And sometimes those things, in growing up as a father and your children learning different values. And I remember one day, I came home, and in school I had learned, that I have feelings, that I should share my feelings, and I should be able to speak my mind, and I have rights and everything. And I remember going home one day, and my dad, told me, "Hey, mijo, throw that trash out." We all had chores and things to do. But I had learned I could speak my mind, and I could share my feelings, and I had rights. So I said, "Wait a minute, Dad, I want to share how I feel about that. I want to share, what I think about that chore, because I got rights." And my dad looked at me and raised his right hand and says, "I'm going to show you a right here." Because in my dad's eyes, me talking like that and speaking against him and challenging him was not rights. It was being disrespectful. And so what I didn't realize is that is I was learning these things in school, learning these Western ways and learning these new values and learning these other things that I went home to a home with a father that was raised in a different way. He wasn't raised to really bring in kids' voices and listen to them that way, that learned that, the father really guided and really was the authoritarian and told us what we needed to do. But I was learning in school, wait a minute, I have my own opinion and things like that. The other thing that I was seeing in school is that, they talked about dads that played with you and dads that read stories to you and dads that took you to the park and 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 in school they said good dads play with you and good dads read to you and good dads take you to the park and good dads hug you and love you and do all of that and and I didn't see my dad do that. My dad didn't necessarily take us to the park. My dad didn't read us stories. My dad didn't necessarily play with us. And my dad wasn't affectionate like that. He didn't hug us and do all of those things. And so in my mind, because I was learning that in school, that good dads do that, in my mind as a little kid, I'm thinking, well, maybe I don't have a good dad. Maybe my dad doesn't really want to read to us, or maybe my dad, because he doesn't hug us, maybe he doesn't love us, and maybe because he doesn't take us apart, maybe my dad doesn't want to play with us. And what I didn't understand is that most of the time my dad was working, and he had to work 2 jobs, and so there were days in which I didn't even see my father, because when I woke up, was at work. When I came home from school, and by the time I went to bed, he was at his 2nd job, and so I didn't see him a lot of times. And my dad worked, and that's what he did. And so what I didn't understand is that if we didn't get fed, then I wouldn't be able to go to school, and I wouldn't have clothes, and I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted to do, and I wouldn't be able to have that bike that I had, and there wouldn't be food on the table. But in school they weren't telling me that; they were just telling me what those other dads did, and didn't understand my father and the way that he did things. And my dad, because he grew up, with so many kids, and the way that he grew up, they didn't do a lot of hugging and touching, and fathers really didn't do that. And so it confused me as a kid, and it even made me wonder: did my dad love me? Does he really want to be around me? Why doesn't he read to me? Why doesn't he play with me? And what I didn't understand is the reason why my dad didn't play with me is because when he was a kid, he had to start working really early as a little boy. He didn't have a lot of playtime as a little kid. My dad, as a little kid, worked and worked and worked. So I don't even think my dad knew how to play. And what I didn't realize, my dad really didn't know how to read books that way. It's not that he didn't know stuff, and it's not that he wasn't knowledgeable. It's not that he wasn't smart about things, because he worked really hard and was able to make a living for us and do things, and he's really good at fixing things and his job and everything. But he wasn't really that good at reading and writing and all those things that they did in school. But see, they didn't tell me that in school. So in school, I thought, well, maybe my dad doesn't want to read to me. And what I didn't realize is that's not what my dad learned when he grew up. And I think that sometimes children get that idea. And my dad, because he was working all the time, he didn't, was not really affectionate with us. And what I didn't realize is that there's different kinds of love. And it's not just the love that you hug a kid and kiss a kid or bring them on your lap or affectionately say I love you or I care for you, because that sometimes didn't go on a lot in my family. But I didn't realize that sometimes it takes love to get up early in the morning and work real hard. And sometimes it takes a lot of love to sacrifice so that your kids have food, and that takes love to sacrifice so that they can have a bike, and it takes love to give up what you want, because I'm sure my dad wanted, his own clothes and his own nice things, but he gave that up so that we would have that, and didn't realize that love comes in a lot of different ways, and that maybe he couldn't go to the park with us, but at least we had a roof over our head, and and we had enough so that my mom could make us lunch, and we could go to the park, and we could have food, and we could do things like that. But I didn't realize all those things, and and I grew up then sometimes not understanding my father. And the other thing is that what I didn't realize, my father had his own issues, and he lived in a society in which they looked at him as a native and Mexican man, and in not a good way. That I didn't understand the word racism and oppression and all those words. I just saw that sometimes they treated my father different because of the color of his skin, and because he didn't necessarily have all the skills and that other men in society had, or speak English in that way. That sometimes people looked down on him and saw him in a different way, and thought because he didn't do all those things that way, that he wasn't as important, that he wasn't as special, that he wasn't as equal. And I didn't understand that that affected my father too, that it affected how he saw himself, and that affected how he carried himself. And then when we would challenge him with these things that we're learning at school, I didn't realize that that was disrespecting him, and that we weren't appreciating him. And I'm sure that there were times in which I looked at my dad and was not really proud of him, because he was not like the other fathers that wore suits and ties and things that I saw on TV and in the movies. And my dad just wore working clothes, and because that's all he had. But I didn't understand how that affected my father too. And I grew up, that way. And sometimes I saw my father would be grouchy, and sometimes he'd be angry, and sometimes him and my mom would argue, and especially when there was not enough money. And my mom would say, well, you need to work harder or find another job. And my dad was doing the best he could. And I didn't understand that affected my father and how he saw himself. And so sometimes him and my mom would argue, and he would use that loud voice in an ugly way and yell at my mom. And I didn't understand that either. And sometimes when my father would really get frustrated, he would go to the refrigerator and begin drinking. You hear, ptsch, and he'd be drinking beer. And then that brought another problem, because now he was drinking. And not that all the time that he was drinking was bad, but sometimes when he wasn't feeling good, or he was depressed or angry and he drank, then my father used that loud voice in another way and would yell at us kids. And I didn't understand. I thought my dad was just angry at us and maybe didn't want us, but I didn't understand that when he yelled and treated us in a harsh way, it wasn't because he didn't love us. It wasn't because he didn't care for us. It was because my dad was going through stuff himself. And I really didn't realize all of this and really recognize all of this still after 13, because my dad died when I was 13. But I had learned it as a young boy, teach young boys, especially in our society and in my culture, that you're not supposed to cry, not supposed to express your feelings. So when my dad died, I didn't cry, because I learned, shut up, don't be a sissy, suck it up, be a man, and don't express your feelings. And so when my father died, I didn't cry. I didn't know how to cry. I forgot how to cry. I thought it wasn't good to cry. And see, and I didn't have no one to teach me how to deal with those feelings and to deal with that sadness and deal with my hurt, because my dad just worked, and he didn't talk to me about that, and he didn't share that with me. He didn't say, well, this is, son, what you do with those things, and this is how you handle this. And I didn't understand there was a father's role to teach your son that, and teach you that it's okay sometimes if you feel these feelings to once in a while cry, and it's okay to be sad sometimes, and it's okay. And sometimes, and I didn't understand till after I was 13 and my father wasn't there, that I wished he was there sometimes just to hold me. Sometimes just to hold me. And even though that wasn't my dad's way, that's what I needed. And what I didn't realize is that sometimes as fathers, we have to do not what we're comfortable with, not what we're used to, not what we grew up with, but sometimes we got to do what our kids need. And, and I didn't realize that till after my father died, and that there were some things that I wish my dad had done with me, and how he had been with me, and I didn't get that a lot of those things, but it really came to me when I became a father, and I had a son, and I began raising him, and then I realized how hard it really was, because it wasn't easy. And you got babies crying and kids that want to do everything, and they're learning these ways, and they want stuff all over, and they're not listening to you. And even when you talk to them, they're still not listening to you. And then family comes over, and can't you control this kid? And why are they acting like this? Or why are they crying or making that noise? And you want to shut them up, but I don't want to yell at them, and I don't want to hit them, and I don't want to do that because that's what I grew up in. But the family is looking at you a certain way. I didn't realize, what a pressure it is to be a dad. You want to be a good dad, but I didn't know what to do, because my father didn't do that with me. And, and so I had to decide, well, so what do I do? Do I just do what my dad did and only do what my dad did? Or maybe I need to try and do more. Maybe I need to try and do what I really wanted my father to do. And even though it wasn't my way, and maybe not even part of my cultural way, maybe I need to consider being a little bit more affectionate, or at least being there for my kids. Because, my dad worked so much that he didn't show up to my school, and he didn't go to my games, and he wasn't there because he was working. And so I, as a dad now, I made a promise to me and to my kids that I was going to do certain things. And I'm going to share with you 4 things that I learned about being a good father and that I tried doing with my kids. And the first thing was to show up, as much as I could in their lives, is to be present as much as I could, waking them up in the morning, doing things with them, playing with them, yeah, but even feeding them. And I know it wasn't my way. It wasn't my dad's way to change diapers or take care of kids and stuff like that. It was the woman's job. But I said, well, let me try it. Let me try, because I want to experience that with my kid too. I want to be close. I want him to be able to trust me and rely on me. And how about if his mom is not around? How about if his mom is not available? Do I just wait and let him be dirty and let him just be, or should I just try and do that? And what I didn't realize much later is that in me trying to do that, my son saw me, and then my daughter later on, and then my other son saw me in a different way, and I was able to be close to them, and they trusted me, and they wanted to come with me, and they wanted me to hold them. And when they fell down, they didn't just look to their mom for comfort, they looked to me. And when they were in trouble and scared, they just didn't look to their mom or somebody else, they looked to me. And so in me trying to do things that I was uncomfortable with, I realized that the first thing is showing up as much as I could in their lives, in doing things with them, in doing things for them. And that meant, going to the school. And even though I didn't understand what was going on in the school and didn't necessarily like what was going on in the school, I showed up, and then trying to be involved in what they did. And the way I did it is I involved myself in my kids' sports. And my oldest son played basketball, and so I tried to learn, how to teach him basketball. And then I became a coach, and I volunteered and did all those because I wanted to show up in their lives. And so showing up in your kid's life in the best way that you can, the most often that you can, is the first thing. Being present, that your child knows that you love them, not just because you hug them or tell them you love them, but because you're there in their lives, and they know you're there in their lives as much as you can. And when you can, to explain to them, I have to work or I have to do this, just share with them so they know you're not there, not because you don't want to be there, because you have to do something else. And what you're doing is really for them anyway. So that first thing of showing up is really important. Then the second thing is sharing your love with your child. And as I mentioned, there's many ways to do it. Yeah. If it's your way, and if you can bring yourself to that, of course, telling them you love them, that you care for them, that they're important to you. There's a lot of ways of saying, I love you. There's saying you're important to me, that I'm so proud of you, that, it's nice to spend time with you. I like playing with you. There's a lot of different ways of saying that you love somebody, and if it's part of your tradition and your way to hug them. And my dad, didn't have a lot of ways. He had one way that he would he would do with us, that he would bring us and play with us. And I call it the lingity. You know, when we were kids, he'd put us on his knee and he'd lingity, 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 lingity. And because we wanted to be close to our dad, Daddy, do the lingity, do the lingity. Okay, come on, lingity, lingity. And then the other one, can you lingity? So he had one of us on each of the lingity, 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 right? And we were having fun with my dad. My dad didn't know how to play and do all of that, but he knew the lingity. And so whatever those ways that you learn, whatever the little songs, baby songs, kids songs, goofy songs, you know, my kids taught me how to dance, you know, and I don't know how to dance their way, but they would dance and play, and I would, you know, I would make up songs with them, whatever songs with their names, and I would sing and I would dance and I'd put on our cultural music, you know, and put that on and sing to them, and so that second way of teaching love is teaching them to love themselves, to love their culture, to love their language, to love their people, to love themselves, right? And so the stories that you know about your country, about your people, about your culture, about your values are so important. And, you know, some of these kids are not going to want to know that, I live here, Dad, now we live here. But it's important to share with them anyway. And if you can teach them traditions and values and customs and faith and spirituality and include them in loving their people, in loving their culture, in loving their ways, that's communicating love. So that second teaching is about love. The third teaching is about paying attention. And what I mean by that is that we need to pay attention because each one of our kids is a little bit different. Each one needs something a little different. There's some kids that like to play a lot and really rambunctious and like to play loud and all of that, but there's some kids that are more quiet. And it doesn't mean they're slow or that there's something wrong with them. It just means that they're different. You know, some kids are like jackrabbits jumping all around. Some kids are like turtles that move real slow. And the turtle is not slower than the jackrabbit. The turtle is just as fast as a turtle. But it doesn't mean that one's faster than the other. It's just that they have a different way or a different personality. And so how do we honor that jackrabbit kid that you have that, you know, got a lot of energy? How do you honor that turtle kid? How do you honor the bird spirit, you know, the one that likes to talk like the birds that speak all the time? You know, how do we honor that kid? We have to pay attention to what they need, to what they want, to what they like, to what they're afraid of. Pay attention to who they are because each kid is a little bit different. Sometimes we want to make all the kids the same. They're different. How do we pay attention to each one of our kids? And yeah, it's hard when you got a bunch of kids, but at least spend a little bit of time special with each one if you can. You know, once in a while, just let them know what's special about them that's different than their brother or sister or somebody else. Each kid is a little bit different, special in their own way. But we also need to pay attention to those kids so we know when they're good, you know, when things are okay. So then we can notice when they're not okay, when something's wrong, when they're going through something. And pay attention about how we can be connected to them and help them in those difficult times, help them in those tough times. How do we do that with our kids, right? So that third teaching of paying attention, right? And then the final teaching, which seems like a really silly one, is surrender. Give it up, because you never know what's going to happen. You know, your kids are going to bring you some lessons, and sometimes they're going to not do so well. Sometimes they're going to struggle. Sometimes they're going to mess up in school. Sometimes they may even get in fights. Sometimes they're going to spill things. Sometimes they're going to not do well in math. And sometimes they're going to challenge you. And sometimes they're going to say, I hate you. Oh, that hurts. Sometimes they're going to not know what they want. Sometimes when they don't know what they want, they just act all over the place. So sometimes you just need to surrender and say, okay, I'm going to do the best I can. And me as a father, I remember when my first son turned 13. We had a big party for him. because in our tradition, that's a very important time. It's a time when a child goes from being a little boy to being a young man. And we had a ceremony and traditions that we followed, and we brought family together to honor him, and people, share with them good words and advice and bring presents, and we eat and we celebrate together in honor of my son. And that was the first time that I had prepared him. You got to speak to everybody. You got to share. Now you're a young man, so you have to speak, and I had to prepare him in our traditional way for that. But after all the food was gone, everybody goes home, right? And I'm sitting there with my son, and he's looking at his presents, and he spoke really good that day. And I went to tell my son Marcos. I said, you did a good job, mijo. Real proud of you. And then something hit me. My son was 13, and that's when my dad died. And what I realized is I didn't know what to do after that. And I had to tell my son, Marcos, I don't know what to do after this. Because your grandpa died when I was 13, and I don't know how to be a dad after this. And Marcos turned to me and says, that's okay, Dad, we'll learn together. And what I've learned is your children can teach you. So my son Marcos taught me some teachings about being a father. And once you get it right with one kid, whoever's up there sends you one completely different, because here comes Renee, and she's completely different. And now I have a whole new set of lessons, and with a little girl, oh my gosh. And she taught me. And then here comes years later, here comes my youngest one, Emilio. And he was completely different too. And he taught me too. So the way I have learned to be a good father is by surrendering to my kids and letting them teach me. And admitting to them sometimes, you know what? Dad doesn't know what to do. I'm not sure what to do here. Admitting to them sometimes, you know what? Dad made a mistake. I'm sorry that I yelled at you. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry that I didn't do this the right way. Can we try it again? It's okay to admit that you didn't do wrong. It's okay that you don't know. It's okay to try it over again. It's okay to say, let's figure this out together. It's okay to do all of those things, to surrender to the journey. It's okay just to do the best that you can. So I want to offer that to all of you. Again, thank you for being good fathers, for being the best fathers that you can be, for sharing what you can. But remember those four lessons. Show up. Be present as much as you can in your child's life. Share with them his love in the way that you can, in the best way you can. Learn new ways. Even though they're not used to it, learn new ways. Stretch yourself a little bit so that your child knows that regardless of how you show it, that you love them, you care for them, you appreciate them. Show them how to love themselves and their culture and their traditions and their ways. Then pay attention to what they need. Pay attention to what's going on. Give them the lessons to prepare them for this society. And then finally, the last lesson, surrender to the journey. Enjoy it. Have fun. Fatherhood should be about fun. It should be about celebration. It should be about joy. And with that, I want to thank you. I want to honor you and congratulate you for showing up today. Do the best you can, and you'll be surprised at the blessings you get. And now I'm a grandfather, and together I have 6 grandchildren. Wow. And I'm learning again, But with those grandchildren, I get to spoil them. I get to do everything and give them what they want and then send them home to their parents, and their parents got to figure it out. Because I'm the tata, I'm the grandpa. And what a beautiful blessing to see that next generation. And to see now my children being wonderful parents, that they can share their love freely with their kids because I did the best that I could to prepare them. And now they're being better parents than I even was. So do the best you can. Share what you can. Walk with your kids, love them in a good way. And may you have many, many blessings along the path. Congratulations on doing the best you can. I want to offer you blessings as being good fathers and being the best you can for your children, and you will realize your blessings through them, that they will gain from you and maybe send those blessings on to the next generations. Thank you all very much.